At the United Nations Conference on Glaciers in Dushanbe, Tajikistan, Pakistan's Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif criticized India's suspension of the Indus Waters Treaty, calling it a unilateral and illegal decision that endangers millions of lives for narrow political gains. He warned that Pakistan would not allow India to cross the red line and accused India of weaponizing water. How misplaced is this claim? An agreement that rests on goodwill as its foundation has been violated by Pakistan not just with the brutal Pahalgam terror attack, but with over 3 decades of similar violations. Hello and welcome. I'm Mark Lynn. Let's connect the dots. Since the late 1980s, Pakistan-backed militant groups have infiltrated Jammu and Kashmir, unleashing a relentless campaign of violence. India has endured countless terrorist attacks, not just in Jammu and Kashmir, but across the nation. The 1993 Mumbai bombings, which claimed 257 innocent lives, were orchestrated with the backing of Pakistan's ISI. The 2001 attack on the Indian Parliament was executed by the notorious Lashkar-e-Taiba and Jaish-e-Mohammed. Pakistan-based terror groups have repeatedly struck Jammu and Kashmir, targeting civilians and places of faith with ruthless precision. In March 2000, the Chhattisgarh massacre saw 36 Sikhs slaughtered in Anantnag. August 2000 witnessed the Nunwan base camp attack, where 32 people, including Amarnath pilgrims, were mercilessly killed. In July 2001, the Shishnag base camp attack resulted in the cold-blooded murder of 13 pilgrims. The Jammu and Kashmir Legislative Assembly bombing of October 2001 claimed 36 lives in a suicide attack. In May 2002, just ahead of the elections, the Kaluchak massacre saw 31 civilians, women and children among them, executed in cold blood. The bloodshed continued with the March 2003 Nandi Marg massacre, which wiped out 24 Kashmiri Pandits in Pulwama. More recently, in July 2017, the Amarnath Yatra attack singled out and murdered 8 pilgrims in Kulgam. The February 2019 Pulwama suicide bombing slaughtered 40 CRPF personnel. Most recently, in April 2025, the Pahalgam attack left 26 civilians, primarily Hindu tourists, dead at the hands of the Resistance Front, an offshoot of the LET. Let's not forget the other major terror attacks across India, particularly the 2008 Mumbai attacks, in which 166 innocent people were killed by LET-trained terrorists. Pakistan's military doctrine of bleeding India by 1,000 cuts is a long-standing strategy aimed at weakening India through asymmetric warfare rather than direct conventional conflict. The doctrine was first articulated by Zulfikar Ali Bhutto in the 1960s, when he spoke of a 1,000-year war against India, something that perhaps US President Donald Trump has fast-forwarded when he said India and Pakistan have been fighting for many centuries.
I guess people knew something was going to happen based on a little bit of the past. They've been fighting for a long time. They've been fighting for many, many decades and centuries, actually, if you really think about it.
The proxy war and state-sponsored terrorism have been Pakistan's state policy since the time of military dictator General Zia-ul-Haq. Prime Minister Narendra Modi told the nation on May 12 that water and blood cannot flow together, while defending India's suspension of the Indus Waters Treaty. Clearly, his words have great significance in understanding India's position on the Indus Waters Treaty. The Prime Minister has emphasized that terror and talks cannot coexist. Pakistan must end cross-border terrorism before any reconsideration of the treaty.
On terrorism itself, as I had said earlier, we are open to discussing the handing over to India of noted terrorist whose list was given to Pakistan some years ago. I would also like to underline that any bilateral discussion on Jammu and Kashmir will only be on the vacation of illegally occupied Indian territory by Pakistan. And on the question of Indus Waters Treaty, I am again repeating myself, it will remain in abeyance until Pakistan credibly and irrevocably abjures its support for cross-border terrorism. As our Prime Minister has said, water and blood cannot flow together. Trade and terror also cannot go together.
India's Minister of State for External Affairs and Environment Kirti Vardhan Singh stated at Dushanbe that Pakistan itself violates the treaty by supporting cross-border terrorism, which interferes with its implementation. He condemned Pakistan for misusing the forum for political purposes, emphasizing that the treaty was based on goodwill and friendship, which has been undermined by security threats. He also pointed out, and importantly so, that fundamental changes such as climate change, technological advancements, and demographic shifts necessitate a reassessment of the treaty obligations. The Indus Waters Treaty, signed in 1960 between India and Pakistan, with the World Bank as a signatory, governs the sharing of the Indus River system. It allocates the eastern rivers, the Ravi, Beas and Satluj, to India for unrestricted use, and the western rivers, Indus, Jhelum and Chenab, to Pakistan, with India allowed limited use for agriculture, domestic purposes and hydropower generation.
We are very conscious that we have been a generous neighbor when it comes to the operation of the treaty. We are an upper riparian state. We have given Pakistan very generously the waters that they are entitled to under the treaty, and we have not even used all the waters we are entitled to under the treaty. But the time for acting on the basis of goodwill unilaterally is frankly no longer with us. We feel that goodwill is a two-way street, and Pakistan must also show that it is capable of acting in good faith before we have an opportunity to resume the full operations of the treaty.
Recent scientific studies indicate that climate change is altering the hydrology of the Indus Basin, making previous agreements less relevant. The pace at which glaciers are melting is higher in the western Himalayas, affecting river flow patterns. Western tributaries like Indus, Kabul, Jhelum and Chenab have more stored glacial water, while eastern tributaries Beas, Ravi and Satluj have significantly lower reserves. Increased population, agricultural demand and hydropower projects require updated water sharing mechanisms. Floods and droughts are becoming more frequent, necessitating adaptive strategies.
There has been significant demographic change. The usage of water in Pakistan is, broadly speaking, now unsustainable because of the number of people drawing water from the Indus. There has also been technological change. The restrictions placed in the treaty reflect the dam engineering technologies of the 1950s. Today, there are new sophisticated technologies available, which would make it possible for us to have modifications which do not harm anybody's interests, but which would enable both sides to have more water used. All of these things, India has been requesting dialogue with Pakistan under the provisions of the treaty, but Pakistan has refused to cooperate.
The fundamental assumptions of the treaty, based on historically stable flow patterns, are no longer valid. India's Ministry of External Affairs has stated that engineering advancements, climate change and melting glaciers make renegotiation imperative. Pakistan remains opposed to any modifications, fearing reduced water availability. India wants renegotiation and Pakistan wants international intervention.
This is an existential threat to Pakistan because we are an agrarian society. It is an existential threat for the 240 million people. So this also lowers the threshold between two countries who are contiguous nuclear powers nowhere else in the world.
India's suspension of the Indus Waters Treaty does not imply that India is acquiring unrestricted access to the Indus, Jhelum and Chenab rivers. It does allow India to increase its usage of these waters, particularly for hydropower and irrigation projects that were previously limited by treaty provisions. India has halted data sharing with Pakistan and is expected to accelerate stalled projects on the western rivers, including hydropower dams and irrigation infrastructure. Pakistan has declared that any attempt to reduce Pakistan's share would be considered an act of war. Talking about acts of war, India has officially revised its war doctrine, declaring that every act of terrorism against India will be treated as an act of war. This shift was announced following the April 22 Pahalgam terror attack and India's subsequent Operation Sindoor, a military response targeting terror infrastructure in Pakistan and Pakistan-occupied Jammu and Kashmir. India will strike decisively at terror hideouts, even if they operate under the cover of nuclear deterrence, and there would be no distinction between terror groups and the governments that support them. Pakistan has accused India of weaponizing water. India maintains that the treaty will remain in abeyance until Pakistan ceases cross-border terrorism, reinforcing its stance that water and blood cannot flow together. As Minister Kirtivardhan Singh said, the treaty's preamble states, the Indus Waters Treaty was concluded in the spirit of goodwill and friendship, and that honoring the treaty, good faith is essential. India is the land of good faith, of Gandhi, Buddha, and of Vishwagurus, Vivekananda, Adi Shankaracharya, Tagore, the list goes on. That is something Pakistan needs to appreciate. Good faith. Once upon a time, in a world hungry for roads, bridges, and shiny new airports, came a wealthy dragon from the east with golden bags of cash and a smile that said, "We just want to help." The dragon whispered sweet deals to dozens, hundreds of developing nations. Take this loan. Build your dream. No strings attached for now. Desperate for progress and seduced by low-interest promises, country after country signed on the dotted line. Ports were built, highways paved, power plants buzzed to life. It was all going so well until the bill arrived. Suddenly, nations realized they owed billions. And guess what? That friendly dragon wasn't so friendly anymore. Can't pay loans? That's okay. Just hand over that port, that railway, that highway, those minerals, or maybe a little political loyalty. Yes, you got it right. We are talking about China. China, the country which traps other countries by its loans. For years, China has mastered a subtle strategic art, loan diplomacy, wrapped in the friendly ribbon of development aid. Beijing's tactics have trapped dozens of countries in webs of debt. Recently, the Australian foreign policy think tank, the Lowy Institute, published a report. It was titled Peak Repayment China's Global Lending, saying that China is set to collect a record amount of money this year. According to the study, debt repayments by developing countries total $35 billion, in which $22 billion are owed by 75 poor countries. China is the single largest source of bilateral lending for those countries, accounting for 30% of all debt service payments combined. The report's author, Riley Duke, said that developing countries are grappling with a tidal wave of debt repayments and interest costs to China. The report bluntly states that China will be more debt collector than banker to the developing world for the rest of the decade. The bulk of the liability came from credit issued under President Xi Jinping's signature Belt and Road Initiative, the BRI, a gigantic international infrastructure venture designed to build roads, schools, ports, and hospitals in developing countries. At its height in 2016, China's lending topped more than $50 billion per annum, surpassing all Western financiers and debt holders combined. And Beijing effectively became a banker to developing nations. Although the Belt and Road Initiative assisted in filling a capital gap in countries habitually deprived of Western outlay, it has triggered allegations of debt trap diplomacy, with apprehensions that China intentionally entangles countries in unrestrainable debt to wield political pressure and influence. Current examination shows Laos, severely beholden to China, now faces an incapacitating debt predicament, partially instigated by the BRI funds. However, China defends its international lending practices.
China's investment and financing cooperation with developing countries abides by international conventions, market rules, and the principles of debt sustainability. A small number of countries promote the so-called China debt responsibility theory while avoiding discussions of multilateral financial institutions and developed countries as the creditors, which are the main sources of repayment pressure for developing countries.
From 1949 to 2017, China has lent money to approximately 146 countries with total commitments of $564 billion, including both loans and grants from state-owned creditors. A prominent example often cited is the Hambantota port, located along the vital east-west international shipping routes in southern Sri Lanka. Unable to repay the $1.4 billion loan for the port's construction, Colombo was forced to lease the facility to China, a Chinese firm, for 99 years in 2017. Another notable example is Pakistan's Gwadar port, which is part of the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, the CPEC. Now, Pakistan borrowed billions for these projects, and struggling with repayments, Pakistan has granted China operational control over Gwadar, enhancing Beijing's influence in the Arabian Sea. Similarly, in Djibouti, China funded a strategic port and military base, with the country's debt to China reaching 70% of its GDP by 2020, raising concerns about potential asset seizure. Maldives is also grappling with a mounting debt crisis that threatens its economic sovereignty. The total debt stock has ballooned from $3 billion in 2018 to $8.2 billion in 2024, projections indicating a further increase to more than $11 billion by 2029. And Bangladesh also, not untouched by this, and publicly requested China, in fact, to reduce interest rates, waive commitment fees, and extend loan repayment periods on its existing loans. The report also highlighted new large-scale loans given to Honduras, Nicaragua, Solomon Islands, Burkina Faso, and the Dominican Republic. China also continues to finance some strategic partners, including Kazakhstan, Laos, and Mongolia, as well as countries that produce critical minerals and metals such as Argentina, Brazil, and Indonesia. Lowy's report also raised questions about whether China will use these debts for geopolitical leverage in the global south, especially with Washington slashing foreign aid under President Donald Trump. In 2021, China also took control of Uganda's Entebbe International Airport, the country's only international airport, due to a loan default. China has built a strong presence in Africa through large infrastructure projects funded by Chinese loans. These deals often benefit Chinese companies, use Chinese workers, and leave African nations with rising debt. India's Foreign Minister, Dr. S. Jaishankar, took a veiled dig at China's Africa policy, criticizing Beijing's extractive models of engagement.
Our engagement has been guided by the 10 principles enunciated by Prime Minister Modi, which reaffirm that Africa's goals and agenda are India's priority. Unlike extractive models of engagement, India believes in an inclusive, demand-driven development cooperation by way of building local capacity and creating local opportunities, ensuring that African countries not only benefit from investments but also develop self-sustaining growth ecosystems.
Here, Dr. Jaishankar pointed towards China's debt trap diplomacy in Africa, China's aggressive lending practices and extractive economic model have led to a growing concern globally about the long-term consequences for African countries, particularly in terms of sovereignty, economic stability and development. This whole situation is putting China in a tough spot. On one hand, there's pressure from other countries to rewrite or ease up on the debt of nations struggling to pay. On the other hand, China is facing its own economic problems and is feeling the heat at home to pull back on those loans. It's kind of a tricky balancing act for them. China's loan disbursements started declining after the peak of 2016. Since the end of the pandemic, it has flatlined at around $7 billion per year. In the span of a few years, China has transitioned from the world's biggest capital provider to the world's leading debt collector. So the clock is ticking. In 2025, about 75 countries are going to be hit by the huge debt repayments that they have to China. And honestly, things are looking pretty tense. The big question now is, will these countries be able to take back control of their own economies? Or are they just going to keep sinking deeper into China's debt trap diplomacy, creating a situation where they're locked into a cycle of dependence that's not only hard to break, but also stifles their growth and autonomy for years to come? We're at a crossroads right now, and it's going to be crucial to see what path these countries take. Will they find a way out, or is China's economic influence going to become too powerful to shake off? Thanks for watching. That's all in this edition of Connecting the Dots. We'll see you next time, the next episode with more raging issues. Until then, it's goodbye from all of us here in the Delhi newsroom. This is Mark Lynn signing off. Take care and stay safe. Namaskar.